So I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Wessels for the kind introduction and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Steering Committee for the invitation to contribute to this semester's WGSS on Wednesdays lecture series. And last and definitely not least, to Heidi Marsh and Anna Grabasi for managing the meeting and managing today's chat and making sure everything goes swimmingly. I'd also like to express a word of gratitude to everyone in the audience for your interest in the subject of my talk, hopefully as enthusiastic interest as Dr. Wessels. It's heartening to see such a strong and supportive showing of folks. In my remarks to you this afternoon, I shall present a revised and expanded version of a paper that I initially drafted a few months ago for a Lambda Classical Caucus conference panel on the reception of the Amazon of Greco-Roman myth. This research, which transported me to 19th century France, well beyond my usual home in ancient Greece, was first inspired roughly 3 years ago while teaching a survey course on women and queer artists. This course, Women and Queers in the Arts, is part of the WGSS curriculum, and so I see today's lecture as a kind of intellectual homecoming and the perfect place to present the latest iteration of the paper. Indeed, I look forward to your questions and feedback at the conclusion of my remarks, since I am currently developing the paper for submission to a special edition of the Journal of Lesbian Studies. In 1853, at the Paris Salon, Rosa Bonheur first exhibited what would become her most celebrated work, The Horse Fair, a monumental, horizontally oriented, oil-on-canvas painting representing an energetic scene from the regular horse markets held on Paris's Boulevard de l'Hôpital. However, given my stated interest in classical reception and the figure of the Amazon, you might be wondering, understandably, what this painting has to do with these topics. The painting's subject is modern and mundane, and thus, and the emphasis is placed on non-human animals. So it may not surprise you to learn that the work's classical cues remain underexplored in the ever-growing scholarship on the artist. Yet, in her biography of Bonheur, the artist's companion, intimate partner, and fellow painter, Anna Klumpke, indicates that classical Greek art had a notable role to play in the genesis of the painting. Bonheur recounts that following the death of her father, her quote, only teachers were the artists in the Louvre and good nature herself, end quote. She goes on to state that while her subject matter draws from her lived experiences of nature, her compositions are nevertheless informed by her historical studies. In the case of the Horse Fair, Klumpke quotes Bonheur's recollection, quote, I would happen to think about the Parthenon Freezes while in a crowd of horse dealers trying out their horses. And why not do something like that? I asked myself, end quote. Bonheur's characteristic straightforwardness might lead us to conclude that the classical reference is limited to compositional matters, or even that the work lacks conceptual depth altogether. However, the last 4 decades of feminist and queer research have occasioned a re-evaluation of Bonheur's work in light of details of her life, socio-political convictions, and art practices. These ranged from her decision never to marry, instead seeking lesbian companionship and forming households with 2 different women, the latter of whom was Klumpke, to her officially sanctioned practice of cross-dressing when conducting art studies in public. Previous interpretations of the Horse Fair have benefited from these and other insights, especially with respect to how the burgeoning 19th century discourses on animal rights tracked on to the nascent women's rights movement. Indeed, these studies show that Bonheur's painting is considerably much more than an artist's interpretation of her experiences of Paris's horse market. By the mid-19th century, the galleries of the Louvre already contained several original artworks and copies that featured interactions between equine and human subjects. Bonheur could have recalled any number of these when witnessing the spectacle of the horse market. So why, in reminiscing on the creation of the Horse Fair, did Bonheur specifically invoke the example of the Parthenon Freeze? Unlike one of the artist's more contemporary documented influences, Theodore Géricault, who overtly incorporated classical references into many of his compositions, for example, these 1817 studies for an ultimately abandoned painting based on his experience of Rome's Corso dei Barberi. Nothing about the setting of Bonheur's horse fair betrays an interest in Greco-Roman antiquity. However, a closer inspection of Bonheur's concatenation of horses and riders yields a diverse disposition of actions and postures that resonate formally with those encountered in several blocks from the cavalcade section of the Parthenon Freeze, and especially its west side. These resonances, in addition to Bonheur's own recollections, make plain the intentionality of these art historical quotations. But in this case, we must assume that Bonheur had to have consulted secondary sources on the Parthenon Freeze, such as the simplified line drawings in Richard Lawrence's Elgin Marbles of 1818, or much more likely, plaster casts created from molds taken of the frieze blocks themselves. By Bonheur's time, there were few European workshops in which cast plaster copies of the Parthenon sculptures were being produced, among them the Louvre's Atelier de Moulage. While plaster casts have only recently attracted renewed scholarly attention after roughly a century of oblivion and neglect, in the 19th century, they were widely distributed among academies and artist studios, museums, and the homes of the wealthy, where they played a fundamental role as instructional tools, surrogates for original works of art, and symbols of their owners' cultural sophistication and aesthetic refinement. As such, copies produced in the Paris-based workshop were circulated throughout the country and even abroad. Such a distribution of plaster casts is exemplified by copies of two of Bonheur's apparent inspirations shown on the screen at right, West Frieze blocks 10 and 8. Both these were manufactured by the Musée Royal, that is to say the Louvre, and purchased in 1821 for the University of Bonn's newly established Akademisches Kunstmuseum. Printed representations or plaster copies must have been Bonheur's source, since the Louvre's collections contain just one actual marble slab of the frieze, showing the so-called Ergastini, and there's no evidence that the artist had traveled at this time to London to see the Elgin marbles in the British Museum, to say nothing of Athens, where many of the Parthenon sculptures remained and still remain. I've yet to be able to locate any visual documentation of how the Louvre's collection of Greek and Roman sculptural casts were exhibited in the galleries around mid-century. But the museum was certainly one of several locations that Bonheur could have encountered copies of the frieze on display and available for study. Today, the Louvre's collection of casts of ancient sculptures live in the Petite Écurie du Roi at Versailles. In the 19th century French Art Academy, classical art continued to be a primary subject of study and the stylistic standard against which good art was judged. And the passion for preserving all things Greek would only be bolstered by French moral and eventually martial support of the Greeks in their struggle to win independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1881 to 1829. But these cultural and political circumstances do little to explain the precise motivations behind Bonheur's reference to the Parthenon Freeze, especially in a work whose genre did not require the grandeur of such art historical references. We must delve further into Bonheur's biography as it relates to its wider Victorian sociocultural context, and more specifically to that of Second Empire France. In so doing, I shall build upon feminist and queer scholarship to argue that in the horse fair, Bonheur subtly casts herself as a sort of modern-day Amazon in an effort to claim for herself a space and a standing in the public sphere equal to those of men. Critical to our analysis is James Saslow's astute observation that the horse fair in all likelihood includes a self-portrait of Bonheur clad in masculine clothing and riding with legs astride her mount. Several points support this reading. The proposed self-portrait appears at the geometric center of the composition. It is only one of two apparently male figures lacking the secondary sex characteristic of facial hair. and the only one who glances directly out at the viewer in three-quarter view, the index par excellence of a self-image created with the use of a mirror. Other features are likewise consistent with the artist's own physical traits. In addition to donning masculine clothing, purportedly to facilitate her work, Bonheur was known to keep her hair short in a stylish yet utilitarian bob cut. Moreover, this figure's hair is longer than any other man in the scene. In addition, if we compare the physiognomy of this figure to contemporary portraits of the artist, we find the same round, soft face, fine eyebrows, straight nose, and fleshy, slightly pursing lips. In placing herself at the center of the action, albeit in a manner essentially indistinguishable from the other male handlers, Bonheur her painted double was committing an act of transvestitism that could not be reconciled with the permitted excuse of artistic professional expedience. That is, Bonheur's masculinized self-image subtly subverted contemporary gendered social norms and laws regarding dress as well as saddlery. Such an appropriation of male prerogatives, sartorial, equestrian, professional, and thus kinetic, recalls yet another classical parallel, the figure of the Amazon warrior. Incidentally, this parallel is very common as a subject in Greek art, treated not only in the West metopes of the Parthenon, but on several other minor and major works of the period. Take, for example, this scene of an armor-clad, spear-bearing Amazon charging upon her male opponent, which appears on a late archaic Greek vase that had been acquired by the Louvre in 1825. While we have no record of Bonheur speaking about Amazons of any kind, it is likely that she would have been familiar with the subject. There are at least two reasons for this. First, Bonheur was clearly versed in classical mythology, as evinced by a poem that she composed in the 1890s, which was inspired by the myth of Actaeon and Diana, a goddess who shared Bonheur's enjoyment of hunting and avoidance of heterosexual matrimony. This poem, which its intended recipient, the sculptor Princess Sturby, described as a, quote, odd composition, end quote, is remarkable as much for its exhibition of Bonheur's classical knowledge as it is for its expression of sympathy for the hunted stag, the unnamed Actaeon. Second, by the mid-19th century, the Amazon, in her vulgarized modern-day guise of the horse-riding woman, was becoming more and more common in French society as a form of transportation, leisurely activity, sport, and spectacle. This development would see the migration of women's horse riding from its traditional province among the rarefied ranks of the aristocracy. Prior to the 19th century, whenever historical women were portrayed on horseback, the viewer could assume they were of noble and especially royal stock. That said, even after broad swaths of the population began to take up horse riding, the long tradition of aristocratic equestrian portraiture continued, as suggested by these representations of Queen Victoria of England and Empress Eugenie of France. Soon, non-nobles were also finding themselves as the subject of artistic representation, thereby confounding the class conventions of this genre. We'll return to the subject of class momentarily. By the middle of the 19th century, the term Amazon, or Amazon in French, had entered into popular usage, at times with pejorative intent to describe any stylish woman who conducted herself on horseback rather than being driven about by carriage. At the heart of mocking references were anxieties over how the increased mobility, public visibility, and independence of female equitation would impact traditional gender roles. Such concerns, which were hardly limited to French society, could be rather straightforwardly conveyed. Take, for example, this cartoon printed in 1859 in the London-based satirical magazine Punch's Almanac. As suggested by the cartoon's punning caption, "Husband Taming," the image equates middle-class female equitation with an inversion of Victorian spousal norms. Within a space resembling a horse stall, two women in sober black riding outfits gesture with their whips toward an apron-clad man attending to an infant and surrounded by familiar household furnishings. A crowd of women witness the spectacle from the left margin and from above. A sign affixed to the back wall advertises a, quote, perfectly unbroken husband next Wednesday, end quote. While the scene shows the man as a happy homebody, the sign suggests that the two women had just completed a demonstration on how to break even the most recalcitrant stallion. In what amounts to no less than the arrogation of male prerogatives, the Amazonian women at the left have, to draw upon an equally telling pun, domesticated the man, making him something quite contrary to his nature, the submissive and obedient party in the relationship. No doubt inspired by the growing visibility of female equestrians in public spaces, several mid-century French artists started treating the subject of the Amazon. Perhaps due to its increasing fashionability and thus its synonymy with modernity, female riders attracted the interest of avant-garde realists like Gustave Courbet and Edouard Manet. In this context, I shall limit my remarks on the portraits of Madame Clément Laurier and Marie Lefebvre to noting that both came from Paris's high society and here dress in the closely tailored black habits that come into fashion by mid-century. In his ultimately uncompleted view of the Exposition Universelle of 1867, Manet gives a prominent position in the composition to an anonymous Amazon, a solitary representative, among others, of the modernized France on display in the pavilions of the World's Fair that unfold directly in the background. According to Carrie Weil's sensitive reading, quote, whether the Amazon is a woman at leisure on a pleasure ride, or in fact exercising one of the horses for the nearby hippodrome or circus is uncertain. The way her torso and head carriage repeats that of the gardener seem to link her with the category of labor, while the dandified dress of the young boy walking the dog reminds us that animals are indeed forms of commodified display, end quote. Weil goes on to suggest that the inscrutability of the riders' class is only further complicated by the fact that professional riders were highly desired as courtesans and were even known to climb the social ladder through marriages to wealthy admirers. While the works of Manet constitute but a brief venture into equestrian subjects, the most prolific and renowned producer of female riders, working in the latter 1840s until 1860, was Alfred De Dreux. A specialist in equine subject matter, De Dreux' paintings could take the form of commissioned portraits or generic scenes made on speculation. I've selected the two paintings on screen not just to illustrate the range between genre and portraiture in De Dreux' oeuvre, but also to hone our attention to the respective riders' clothing, one colorful and showy, the other sober and restrained, which could refer to a distinction between the leisurely riding of the amateur Amazon and the exercises of the professional écuyère. Yet, the distinction can also be attributed to changing fashions. By 1850, when female equestrians of all sorts were donning more quote-unquote masculine habits, like that worn by our écuyère. Despite changes in color, palette, and cut, amateur and professional alike remain in the side saddle with skirted legs and tight corseted jacket. Indeed, as Alison Matthews David has observed in a relevant study of Victorian England, women's riding habits were from the very beginning an androgynous amalgamation of sartorial features that connoted the paradox of mobility and constraint. But by the turn of the 20th century, their style became increasingly indistinguishable from their male counterparts. Such a blurring of gender lines was a cause of concern and anxiety for adherents to the bourgeois cult of domesticity and the ideals of true womanhood. Recall the satirical cartoon of Punch's Almanac, which was informed by just such a concern. Any opinions that Bonheur may have had on the topic of Amazons, ancient or modern, do not survive. Fortunately, though, her esteem for De Dreux as an animalier, an animal painter, is transmitted in Anna Klumpke's biographical account. Bonheur distinguished De Dreux among her quote-unquote favorite guides, and thus had tried to acquire as much of his work as she could, including this painting of a noble woman riding en Amazon, as to say, with side saddle. The catalog published for Bonheur's estate sale does not provide any information on how or when she acquired this artwork or others in her collection. That said, most of Bonheur's personal papers and records remain in the attic of her chateau and are only now being examined and archived by Michel Ponce. I recently contacted Mr. Ponce to see if any new information had since come available. I was informed that no such records have yet been located. But Mr. Ponce noted that Bonheur frequented the exhibitions of the Salon and public sales where works by De Dreux could be seen and acquired. Whether or not Bonheur owned works by De Dreux by the early 1850s, it is hard to imagine that she would be unfamiliar with one of the most prolific equestrian painters, and who, we might admit, in view of his frequent use of the same compositional schemes, especially in his portraits and Amazons, could risk at times being, as it were, a one-trick pony. This criticism should not take away from his much appreciated handling of paint, and in fact, Bonheur would go on to acquire no fewer than 17 works by De Dreux, all of which were put up for auction upon her death. 5 of these 17 featured in Amazon. The relevance of De Dreux's equestrian images, and specifically those featuring Amazons, to Bonheur's self-portrait in the Horse Fair awaits more detailed study. We have already noted how the physical features and position of Bonheur's face betray an act of self-portraiture. But now, with the benefit of comparison to De Dreux's equestrian portraits, we can appreciate this point all the more. Bonheur and her horse are arranged in the conventional mode, largely in profile and essentially parallel to the picture plane, which offered the most representative view of the rider and their mount. One final detail should also be observed with respect to the formal conventions of equestrian portraiture, and this is Bonheur's more realistic proportions of riders to their mounts. In the long line of elite equestrian portraiture, especially when it concerns authority figures, there's often a manipulation of the scale or positioning of the human rider to counteract any diminishment of their stature by comparison to the more physically imposing animal. This can be done by making the human larger than life, as in the statue of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, or by using dynamic articles of dress to provide artificial volume to the figure, as in the billowing dress in Dosset's portrait of Queen Victoria, or both, as with Jacques-Louis David's famous rendering of First Consul of France, Napoleon. What these solutions meant to curtail, the comparatively greater physical power and presence of the horse, was exactly what Bonheur played up in the Horse Fair. That an animal painter would do this is perhaps unsurprising, though it has greater conceptual implications that we'll explore in due course. De Dreux's portraits are consistently situated within tree-lined clearings or along densely forested paths, as befitted his overwhelmingly noble patrons and their pastime of riding and hunting. But these recreational sites had been giving way to non-elites too. In 1852, with its purchase and gift to the city by Napoleon III, the Bois de Boulogne, once a royal hunting ground, became the public space for wealthy and aspirational Parisians to engage in equestrian activities. Ownership of horses was affordable for a greater number of people, though a horse could also be rented out much like a rowboat in a park. Because of this, the fashionable equestrianism on display at the Bois entailed not only blurring of the traditional boundaries of gender, but also of socioeconomic class. In other words, of one's breeding. We'll return in the latter part of this talk to the horse and other animals as a symbol or transitional object in contemporary French discourses on gender, nature and culture, and women's rights. For the moment, it's important to mention that Bonheur's Horse Fair coincides with the inaugural years of the Bois de Boulogne as a public park, and thus can be seen as another historical symptom of the widespread flair for horses in the French capital. Though here, Bonheur has quit De Dreux's more leisurely bourgeois haunts of country estates and public parks at the periphery of the city in favor of a decidedly more working class venue in the urban center. But even in so doing, Bonheur does not efface the presence of the bourgeois and their modish pursuits. They appear among a mixed crowd of spectators assembled to watch this parade of the most fashionable breed of the time, the percheron. I submit that Bonheur's documented interest in monuments and myths of classical antiquity, her existence at a time of growing female equitation, and her particular affinity for De Dreux' work permit us to regard her as a sort of Amazon, but one distinct from those promenading about the public parks and boulevards of Paris. No mid-century Amazon or écuyère was ever so butch in appearance and bearing as Bonheur in her horse fair. She sports clothing expressly designed for a man, including trousers, which permits her to sit upon a saddle designed for a man, legs astride her mount. Bonheur's riding is concerned with labor, not play or display. Her self-image is thus one of complete equality with her male colleagues through common dress, common space, common action. In other words, it comes closer to the cultural and political implications of the classical Amazon, who spurned the traditional expectations of women for more mannish pursuits, including riding and warfare. The scene is, however, a partial fantasy, made possible by deftly navigating the real-world social and legal constraints placed upon any respectable woman who wished to escape the cult of domesticity and its financial dependence upon men in order to lead a professional public life. I say that the fantasy was partial because in 1855, the year that the final touch-ups on the horse fair were completed, Bonheur purchased a mare named Margot that she used to ride about town, including trips between her studios downtown and in the countryside at Chevilly. So, Bonheur numbered among the actual Amazons of Paris. What's more, another of her biographers, Theodore Stanton, shares the accounts of two friends of the artist who recall the frequent sight of Bonheur riding outfitted in an eccentric combination of loose-fitted men's clothing, with legs straddling her mount. The outfit typically included a frock coat, knee breeches or trousers with understraps, boots, sometimes with spurs, and a broad-brimmed cap of felt or straw with a velvet band. And she would even ride in such a manner in the poshest parts of town, including the Bois de Boulogne. After she purchased a Chateau cum studio bordering the forest of Fontainebleau in 1859, Bonheur could be seen wearing her peculiar equestrian outfits for activities that did not involve riding. It would therefore seem that gender-bending equestrianism, or Amazonism, was a fundamental element of Bonheur's identity and one that was heralded, albeit quietly, by her cameo in the horse fair. In this, her personal Parthenon Freeze, Rosa Bonheur appropriates the widespread imagery of the Amazon, adapting it to a male-oriented space of labor and pressing it to its logical masculine extreme. In her artwork, as in her life, Bonheur thus actualized the very claims of androgyny and gender equality that were a cause of anxiety for beneficiaries and defendants of the status quo. Bonheur's horse fair was therefore a visualization of much more than an artist's and a people's love of horses and riding. But we would be remiss if we did not turn our attention, at long last, to the eponymous stars of the painting, the horses. Indeed, as Albert Boim noted, unlike riders and grooms produced by the sculptors of the Parthenon Freeze or earlier contemporaries like Géricault, where men exert a symmetrical power over the beasts, quote, the men are swallowed up in the dramatic sweep of the horses, both as a result of the exaggerated and disproportionate size relationships and their curious formal distribution, end quote. Or, as Carrie Weil put it, Bonheur, quote, puts horses on display at the moment before they are sold, when they are most free to parade their physical beauty and power, but also their capacity for what might be called moral agency, here revealed in their spiritual resistance, as well as their capacity for shared synchronous movement, end quote. Interestingly, as several scholars have rightly observed, when compared to the men around her, Bonheur seems exceptionally calm and in sync with the movements of her horse. So while Bonheur emphasizes the grandeur and potency of her equine subjects, she also seems to suggest a superior skill at obtaining her animals' cooperation. It is particularly relevant here to note that Rosa Bonheur would later build a veritable menagerie of largely free-roaming animals on her estate and was posthumously quoted speaking of her pet lion, Nero, in this way, quote, "In order to secure the affections of wild beasts, you must love them," end quote. Perhaps we ought to see this in this nested equestrian self-portrait, an early testimony to the contention that tenderness, not violent force, is the best way to tame a horse. Poetry unintended there. On the most fundamental level, Bonheur's spotlight on the horses is understandable in view of her specialization as an animal painter and her well-documented admiration of and respect for animals as sentient beings with their own perspective and whose existence was not simply meant to serve the dominion of man. But another, metaphorical level easily follows from this conviction, according to which the horses could be seen to enhance the underlying feminist and queer significance of the painting. Bonheur lived and worked at a time of society-wide debates over the relationship of nature to culture, of animals to humans, especially as it concerned the subjecthood and rights of animals, and accordingly, the responsibilities of humans to them. And in her life, she would also witness the advent of the women's movement and the medicalization of homosexuality as a mental disorder. Although she never treated women's or queer issues in any overt fashion in her art, her animals could, in Saslow's words, have, quote, offered a symbolic arena for personal concerns, end quote. This is not a difficult maneuver to imagine, since the struggles of women and animals were often compared or analogized in the latter half of the 19th century. From its very beginnings, Bonheur's artistic oeuvre attests to her oft-remarked talent for eschewing the usual habit of representing animals in objectified, sentimentalized, or anthropomorphic ways, instead investing her subjects with genuine individuality and conscious free exercise of their agency. A particularly eloquent attestation of this approach to animal painting is her earlier Paris salon success, Plowing in the Nivernais. One immediately appreciates Bonheur's greater attention to the animal than the human, with the oxen treated as individuals rather than as a homogeneous team, each reacting in its own way to the burden of the plow. As for the plow, note that Bonheur has depicted the chain which runs between the two files of oxen, but how is this chain secured to the animals? Where are the harnesses which yoke the oxen to the apparatus? Bonheur has hazarded a serious departure from realism in order to visualize the oxen as mutual actors in the agricultural endeavor who freely assent to a collaboration without the need of bindings. Here, we find a cooperation, not a contest, of culture and nature, man and non-human animal. When we recall the age-old equation of women with nature and men with culture, and eventually of queers with the unnatural, to say nothing of the practices of domesticating or breaking animals like horses, it isn't hard to see how Bonheur's paintings could be read as coded cultural commentaries masquerading in the metaphorical clothing of a seemingly apolitical genre. After all, Bonheur herself likened traditional female marital roles to a kind of hobble, an entrave, used to hinder the free-ranging movement of animals like horses. Our analysis is now coming around the proverbial bend and heading for the finish line. Given Bonheur's penchant for restoring to her animal subjects the individualism and conscious agency that had been largely denied to them in the Western artistic tradition, it is interesting that the artist would return to the Parthenon Freeze as an inspiration for her horse fair. To some degree, the choice is eminently understandable. The frieze was monumental in scale, horizontally formatted, and featured a dynamic procession of male riders and horses in diverse bodily configurations. Less immediately obvious is why she seems to quote sections of the frieze, such as the rearing horses and rider seen in West Block 10. Numerous surviving sketches and compositional studies indicate that the horse fair was not a literal photographic snapshot of a singular moment. It is rather a pastiche of distinct elements whose varying arrangements Bonheur experimented with, always with consideration for compositional conventions. One such convention involved how dynamic movements of horses were rendered, as their speed outpaced the capacity of the human eye and brain to capture their distinct phases. No matter how astute a student of animal anatomy and behavior Bonheur was, prior to Edward Muybridge's pioneering photographic series, The Horse in Motion of 1878, artistic renderings of horses' limbs in rapid movement were nevertheless highly stereotyped and in notable cases like the gallop, inaccurate. For horse-loving artists like Géricault before her and Bonheur, monuments like the Parthenon Freeze provided time-honored models. Bonheur's Parthenonian formal references invested the horse fair with the pomp of a ritual performance. Here you can see a somewhat inaccurate pair of galloping figures in an earlier study below, incidentally. It is probably most fitting to conclude this discussion of the horse fair with a short meditation on horses, which Klumpke found among Bonheur's papers, in which she reproduced in the autobiographical component of her book. It speaks of the horse as, quote, just a slave that the creator entrusted to man, and which man abuses in his ingratitude and cowardly, selfish wretchedness, even to the point of making himself lower than the most brutish beast, end quote. We can now certainly understand Klumpke's seemingly tangential follow-up remark, quote, it will come as no surprise that Rosa Bonheur often talked about women's place in contemporary society, end quote. A modern-day Amazon, Bonheur not only spoke of alternatives to the alleged natural place of women in society, she embodied these principles in her gender nonconforming self-presentation, lesbian relationships, and pursuit and attainment of international success in the male-dominated world of academic painting. Her nested self-portrait in the horse fair, clad in men's clothing and mounted with legs astride her horse, is equally radical. Projecting her Amazonian self-image into an unorthodox context, whether it be Paris's horse market or the cavalcade of her Parthenonian inspiration, Bonheur claims equal right to the spatial mobility, self-determination, and professional agency long regarded as the prerogatives of men. As a brief epilogue, and as a means to convey just how radical Bonheur's Amazonian self-image was, I leave you with these two early 20th century portraits by American expat lesbian artist Romaine Brooks. The self-portrait at left shows the artist with short cropped hair and wearing a riding cap and suit of a decidedly masculine cut that works to de-emphasize the contours, that is, the sex, of Brooks' body. To the right is a portrait by the same artist, this time her lover, the socialite Natalie Barney. While Barney's clothing has a touch more feminine look to it, one cannot miss the statuette of a galloping horse placed on the table before her. Interestingly, the horse has been fitted with a harness and reins, but seemingly moves without a rider. The work's byname, the Amazon, might suggest that the rider is none other than Barney herself. Having considered the life and work of Rosa Bonheur, we are now well placed to recognize how and why equestrianism and female masculinity would become fundamental parts of the visual identity of queer new women of the early 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. We did get to the horses at the end and Muybridge, so I'm delighted. So now we do have some time for questions. As you all use your clap emojis, thank you. I'm going to give everyone a minute to think about their questions, but you will be able to unmute yourself, throw up a physical or a virtual hand, or you can write your question in the chat. So please think about what you want to say while I take advantage of asking the first question, because I want to. So one of the things I loved is you sort of brought together all of these different threads, right? Thinking about gender, thinking about the horses themselves, thinking about the costuming, thinking about kind of the historical context. So as someone who, specializes in ancient Greece, but I know that this is also something you work on, I'm curious if you could just tell us a little bit about your kind of like process of coming to this painting and this particular approach to this painting. Like, did you start with the Parthenon inspiration, or did you start with kind of thinking about the painting itself? I just would love to hear a little bit about how you kind of got to this and the research process that develops this.
Thank you for that question. I'll say Chelsea here. We'll talk colleague to colleague. We have a lot of students here, but that actually is a segue to my response, is that I actually appreciate this question because I see a lot, very happy to see a lot of students, many of whom are taking art history, present in the audience, and several others in the humanities. So it's actually kind of nice to get a moment to speak on the basis of process as to how a research paper like this actually unfolds. I alluded to this a little bit in the introductory remarks that I gave, how this really emerged in the first of two teachings since being at ETSU of what began as women artists and their art, and then I revised it in the curriculum to add LGBTQIA artists and art into the class. So now it's women and queers in the arts, but it's essentially the same class, and I actually taught the class as a queer inclusive class from the beginning. But it was actually in the context of teaching that class that I sent a lecture dedicated to the 19th century and to the intersection of kind of Victorian ideals of the woman and how those tracked onto and were in many ways inconsistent with being a professional woman artist in the 19th century. And so Rosa Bonheur, she is not, it would be an understatement to say that or an overstatement that she is obscure. I mean, today she is a household name and she is one of the most famous women in the history of art, although she is still, despite that, relatively understudied. And I'm hoping that her archives will spur on yet more research in this respect. But Rosa Bonheur, because of her importance, being one of the first kind of internationally successful women. She was the first to be awarded the Legion of Honor in France. So she has a number of feathers in her cap. So she was a kind of essential part of my lecture there. And as I was preparing and doing research, just out of the necessity of teaching a lucid and informative lecture on the 19th century, I came across this reference of Rosa Bonheur referring to this painting as her Parthenon Freeze, essentially. And that might not have excited readers who have home bases in other eras and cultures of art history, but as a Greek specialist, that piqued my interest. And so I immediately started trying to figure out why in the world this reference was made, and actually started then compiling. I mean, I first saw immediately, comparing the frieze to the painting, those formal resonances there, but then of course didn't answer some of the deeper conceptual questions. So I from there started looking at available bibliography on this painting and on the artist. And I kept finding everyone saying, this is her Parthenon Freeze, this is her Parthenon Freeze, with no development of that argument, with actually no pursuit of what that actually meant. What was she actually looking at? How does this actually have anything to do with a contemporary scene in 19th century France with, how far and how different is that? So it began, as you said, as this comparison to the Parthenon, and then realizing that this comparison, despite being in Bonheur's own words, not even a stretch, right? It's not even an argument you have to make, that I hadn't found any scholars who actually wanted to pursue that thread or that kind of analytical direction.
I love that too, because I think it's such a good example of kind of the way that like our teaching and our research are in fact linked, even when you're not teaching, your exact specialty. I think that's so great. And, we're always like talking about that abstractly, but I love a concrete, like, no, I was teaching this class and I saw this thing that connects to my very specific research interests, and boom,
absolutely,
an idea.
And that's actually what I was remiss in saying and was going to put as the conclusion to my response, was that actually this was deliberately an instance of, yes, our research informs our teaching, right? We only can be good teachers if we're up to date on what we're teaching, but our teaching can inform our research. right? And if I had not taught women and queers in the arts and extended myself well beyond my expertise and my home base, this project would never have happened.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, yeah, I just gave a conference paper this past weekend on something that is not directly in my expertise, that came out of teaching. So,
right.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Julie.
Hi, Dr. Fowler.
Hi, Julie.
So I have a question that may not be relevant, but I'm definitely curious about this. When you were researching this paper, did you come across any indication that, or any reference that she may have alluded to or be making to Epona or Maka or perhaps Rhiannon, maybe? Any connection to war and...
Yeah, I haven't found, her published papers and published correspondences are pretty laconic with respect to what she was reading and what she was thinking about. She was clearly a really smart, widely read woman. She has an enormous library in her chateau that is actually still not cataloged either. Like, part of this is hinting students, if you want a direction as a burgeoning scholar where there's going to be a lot of material to work on, Rosa Bonheur and her archives are going to prove, I think, really informative as more of them are actually archived. And that's also for you, Julie, as an archivist, someone who has a lot of interest in archives. That basically what's exciting, what's terrifying and exciting. Terrifying is that basically anything we've written about Bonheur could be proved wrong by further evidence that's going to come out of the archives. But that's also exciting that we haven't exhausted the available information that's there. It's just been in an attic since 1900. I saw Joan had a hand raised.
Yes, hi, thank you, thank you. I thought that was brilliant. I just loved every minute of it and all of the intersections with antiquity and current, queer theory, et cetera. So thank you, I really enjoyed that. I will follow up with you on a number of things that really caught my interest. I want to say, especially bringing in the equestrian imagery in male-dominated art as an affirmation of masculinity from Marcus Aurelius onward, I think is such a strong thing, not simply that she's inventing that, of course. But I wanted to ask a question. Since this does seem so classical or neoclassical in its Parthenon reference, but she's really later than the neoclassical movement in French art, and I'm unfamiliar with all of her other work. You showed a little bit. So I wanted to ask you, as an art historian, how do we situate her with neoclassical art? And is this her only reference, or are there other references to the classical world?
That is an excellent question. It is one of the things that is unresolved. I mean, this is a work in progress. And one of the things that's really vexing me is that when you look at some of her references, I mean, even her post-classical references like Géricault and De Dreux, they are thoroughly like romantic, right? In many senses. I mean, they are like firmly within like a romanticism, but she's looking to those artists, but there's not much of the romantic really in her paintings. They're definitely more in the kind of realist camp that we would expect of a mid-19th century kind of academic. I mean, we're somewhat academic. I mean, their position in the academy is somewhat being negotiated at that time. But what's really puzzling is that I've not found, there's certainly no reference I've been able to find to any other work being linked with a classical monument. And I admittedly haven't looked at, I mean, the number of paintings. Not all her paintings are as great as the horse fair. Some of them are a little bit more middling paintings, but she has so many paintings that she produces in her life that it's a really large body of work. But they are all easier to reconcile with mid-19th century animal painting as a kind of offshoot of realism, kind of interesting kind of contemporary life. So it's something that's really puzzling me why this work imports into it this kind of grand reference to one of the most important monuments of the Western tradition. And part of why I think that she's doing this, and I don't make this argument explicit because I'm not sure yet whether I buy it, is that this work is exceptional in her body of work. It is the only work, with the exception of one other possibility that Saslow proposes that I'm not as convinced, that has her self-image incorporated into it. So I think that there's something about this being more than just an animal painting or a kind of contemporary scene of on the farm or in the market, that by including herself there, it's adding a dimension or a level, a kind of personal level there that I think involves some kind of exceptional references and elements that she's bringing in. So I'm not fully convinced by that yet, but I think that this painting is in so many ways exceptional in her body of work. I mean, it is also larger than anything she ever produces. I mean, it is massive. If you've ever been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I know, Joan, you have, it occupies an entire wall of a really large gallery. This is an enormous painting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? We have a comment in the chat from Matt asking for an analysis of Julie's background art, which feels on point for our discussion today. But of course, if other people have questions, comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. Raise your hand. Come off mute.
And I'll put my email in the chat too, because if not, I know sometimes it takes a while to formulate things. I'm welcome even over email, any questions, comments, even bibliography that you think I may not have or should read. I'm open to all of that. Like I said, it's a work in progress. And Chelsea, you mentioned, and this is one of the things I would say to the students, is be courageous in your research. Right, I'm really kind of putting my head out on a block here for several specialists in many fields that know way more than I do, and will probably, when I put this in front of a peer review eventually, I'm going to get comments and criticisms, because of course I'm an ancient Greek scholar who's now talking about social and political circumstances in 19th century France, animal painting, the history of fashion, the history of equitation. Right, you can imagine the number of disciplines I've had to try to wrestle with their own bibliography, so that there's a certain degree I would encourage undergrads, be courageous with your topics. Don't just stay where you're comfortable, because some really interesting things can happen when you put yourself out there. And I definitely am. This is the most vulnerable I've ever felt when I've given this paper now twice, right? There are many things I still don't know.
I love that. And I think that like academic intellectual vulnerability is important, because, we're learning things and you see things probably from a slightly different angle than maybe some of the special. Obviously, I'm not an art historian, but one of the things, if people are not going to jump in with questions, I have to ask about the cross-dressing permit that you just sort of threw up that image of. And could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, what Rosa Bonheur has a cross-dressing permit for, there were very few stipulated exceptions by law where women were allowed to go into public wearing gender inappropriate clothing, right? Speaking from the perspective of the state here. And by and large, the biggest category are medical reasons. And so it appears that Bonheur actually obtained this permit with medical reasons, all right, is the kind of citation, but really she obtained them to be able to conduct her work as an artist in order to facilitate her work, I should say. You could imagine the kinds of dresses and clothing that women, right, were wearing at the time, that going into a dusty street, sitting on a hill and sketching, going into a muddy farm. She was also known to go into slaughterhouses to study animals. So she's going into places that on a very kind of basic level are dirty and mucky and bloody and wearing, right, the kind of clothing that a woman would be expected to wear, right, a proper woman of the time, is just not practical, right? So that's, on one level, that's the professional excuse. Although what I hope to have shown in the talk later on was that she begins wearing this really masculine equestrian attire, even in circumstances where she's not riding. Right, so she has a professional excuse, but in the privacy of her own home, she seems to be preferring to wear this kind of clothing. And we actually even have anecdotes that she lived next door at Fontainebleau. Of course, there is a royal residence on the other side of the forest at Fontainebleau, and she used to despise the Empress Eugénie because she would just drop by her chateau unannounced, and Rosa would have to run into a room and put on a dress. Right, she'd have to put on something proper to be to have an audience with the Empress. Right, so this is someone who is using in public the official excuse of professional expediency, but it seems that this is much more integral to her identity. All right, it's not merely cross-dressing for profession; it's actually gender nonconform, what we might call gender queer, right, or gender nonconformity for the time.
Yeah, I had no idea, and that just sort of popped up, and I was like, "Oh, I feel like I want to know more about what that certificate is, why you would get it." That's really cool. I had no idea.
And you had to renew it. You had to renew it several times, right? So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because you said something in your talk that it was like for a limited period of time. Amazing. So we have 1 minute left, or I'm guessing less than 1 minute left. So I want to, if nobody has any final burning questions, but you do have Michael's email, if you do, I want to just say thank you again to Dr. Michael Fowler for this amazing talk, which really wraps up our first year of being WGSS in such a fantastic way. So yeah, throw up your little yellow hands or your actual hands, depending on whether you have your video on or not. But I want to thank you so much for this talk, not just because I'm a horse girl, I really loved it. And thank you to everyone who came. I hope we'll see you again next year when our series starts again with a whole new lineup of superstar speakers. But this was such a fun way to go out, and thank you all for coming. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to all of you for coming. I know it's a busy time of the year, so I really appreciate it.